Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. For those that are new, my name is Ben, and what I'm trying to do here is actually trying to discover all the different types of jobs that are out there. Now, if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you can check out all my other videos and stay up to date in terms of what other job roles that I'm going to be covering. For this video, I'm going to be going over the role of a service designer. Now, I'll be going over what that service design actually means. I'll be going over in terms of what they do in their day-to-day activities, 3 awesome tips if you want to get into the role of a service designer. I'm going to clarify some misconceptions about the roles. Probably one of the most important one is whether this role is going to be relevant in the next 5 to 10 years. So what does service design actually mean? Well, I like to think of service design as the intersection between, the people, so the employees and customers, your processes and your technologies. So being able to have that holistic view and being at the center of it all. So being able to understand also, not only how a solution works, but the interactions between the technology as well and the back-end systems, all the data flow as well, and how it interacts with the user. Now, something that we'll probably want to do first is to clarify the difference between a business designer and a service designer, because they do get mixed up from time to time. Now, when I like to think about it, business design is sort of focused more on the management consulting side of things using a design sort of methodology or practice. Whereas a service design is sort of more managing the product or the service and actually just trying to understand the problem and how to solve it. Now, if we look on a scale between all the different designers, if we look at the more technical side, it starts off with UI design, then it moves into a bit of UX design when it starts to deal with a bit more of the people aspect and user flow. And then I like to think of it as the service designers, which comes next, where it's the interactions between the technology, people, and the processes. And then finally, on the other end, where it's a bit less technical, we like to focus more on the becoming a business designer. So what does a service designer actually do in terms of, a day-to-day aspect? Well, they generally split into 2 different paths. You can either do consulting or you can either do in-house. Pretty similar to what a UX or UI designer would be able to do as well. Now, I know this may be quite cliche when it comes to it, but when it comes to consulting or when it comes to sort of service design work, a lot of it is really dependent on the actual project. So again, every single problem is different, so being able to solve it makes it a bit more interesting. Therefore, the activities that you do will change. So if you really had to boil it down to what activities or the tasks that you will actually be doing in this sort of role, the first one is generally, you'll be doing a lot of planning, you'll be doing a lot of running of sort of workshops, and then finally at the end of that, you need to do a lot of consolidation of the workshop. So being able to take all this information that you've just collated from all the workshops and then turning that information into something very valuable for the business. So you'll be creating assets such as, the personas and the service blueprints, which we can cover in later episodes. So the second thing a service designer will sort of do is forward planning. A lot of times they will have to look ahead in terms of how do I solve this problem? So look at today and look at what's up ahead in terms of, okay, how do I get from basically point A to point B, and being able to come up with a solution that actually is able to solve that root cause problem. Finally, I know it's quite generic, but you really need to do a lot of analysis. When you're a service designer, you deal with a lot of ambiguity. So you're dealing with a lot of unknown things that you're not even sure of yourself. So a lot of times you really have to understand and really dive deep into the work that you're doing. So trying to take in all the information from all your workshops, from all your interviews, and from just reading documents in general, and actually consolidate it into something useful and valuable back to the business. So moving on to, if you are someone who really wanted to get into this role, what are some tips that I could help provide to you so that, you could get a bit of a head start into it? Now, when it comes to service design, it's actually quite fluid in terms of the definition. There's no real definition when it comes to service design. So there's actually no real requirement. But if you really had to boil it down to sort of 3 different sort of tips, the first one would generally be curiosity. So as a service designer, you really have to have that curious mindset when it comes to just being able to solve a problem. Now, the reason I say you have to have a really curious mindset is because ambiguity comes with the role in everything that you're doing. Again, a client won't come to you with a very well-defined problems. It's going to be very ambiguous, and it's going to be something like, okay, I need to solve this problem to reach this target. You're going to have to figure out how to do that. You're going to figure out what's going on in the company, and you're going to figure out in terms of how to even get there. Now, I know it's quite ambiguous even with the idea of how to become curious or how to even demonstrate that. Now, a way that you can kind of do that is actually talk about your past experiences. So in the interview, if you're talking to the interviewer, so what you can do is actually bring up your past experiences, talk about how you went about solving that problem, and demonstrate that curiosity through there. So something unique. And it doesn't even have to be to do with design or your background when it comes to experience. Just being able to show that, you've been really curious about a problem space, something very interesting and very personal to yourself, and how did you go about it? That already demonstrates demonstrates curiosity to people. So the second thing would be having a problem-solving mindset, or really enjoy solving these problems, because the business will come up to you and be like, hey, I want to achieve this user experience, but my tech doesn't allow it and my business just doesn't agree with me. So how do you go about in bringing the user along to say, hey guys, here's the problem that we really need to deal with and here's a way to solve it. Now this sort of brings us along to the third point, which is you need to be able to have teamwork and empathy when it comes to this job. Now, I mean, I'm just talking about designers in general. You really need to empathize with the user to understand what their problems are or their pain points are. And then from that, you need to understand, well, if that is an issue, how do I change the technology, or how do I change the process, or how does it interact with the people to then come up with a solution? Now, it's really important to empathize with them because you need to be able to communicate, convince them, and then bring them along the journey with you. Now, if you really wanted to get into a service design role, but you're a bit worried because, there might be some myths or misconceptions behind these roles. And again, it's quite normal because this happens to all types of jobs that are out there. So what are the sort of myths and misconceptions behind the service designer? Now, when it comes to design in general, it's a bit of a gray space because again, there's no real definition or requirement when it comes to it. The role generally keeps changing and it depends even on the organization itself. So one of the misconceptions about the service designer role is that they mistake it for a business analyst. Now, don't get me wrong, it generally starts off as a business analyst in the IT world and in the project, because you always need a business analyst in sort of every single project that you do in the tech world. So a lot of the work that a BA does gets eroded away by what a designer can actually do. Now, companies are pivoting into new ways of working and trying to reclassify the job roles around it. So a lot of the business analysts are actually reclassifying themselves to be actual designers. Although a business analyst can successfully transition into a service designer, they are only transitioning across 2/3 of the skills that are actually required to be a service designer. When it comes to a service designer, the BA is missing a bit of a gap. That gap is the deep understanding in design methods and enterprise design thinking. It's not really too hard to bridge this gap because there's a lot of resources online, companies teach you these things, and you can readily learn this by yourself. And finally, it's not so much a myth or misconceptions, but we do generally see the trend going in the sense that a lot of service designers are transitioning to focus on an actual platform, such as, Salesforce or Adobe. So for a lot of the service designers that want to specialize in these platforms, you really have to understand the gap in order to make a successful transition into them. Finally, and probably one of the most important questions, is whether this role is still going to be relevant in 5 to 10 years time. In my personal opinion, I don't think this role is going anywhere, and I still think that this is going to be relevant. Now, why do I say this? Is because remember, the service designer is sort of the interaction or the intersection between, people, processes, and technologies. Now, you can always put yourself in the middle of those three. It really does feel like a human skill. Maybe some of the parts that you do in terms of your jobs, in terms of micro level, can be automated, and fair enough, that could happen to every other job. But when it comes to trying to solve a problem, trying to understand the technologies, trying to convince users and bring them along the journey, I think that skill set is always going to be relevant no matter what we think about it. Now, the technologies might change in the next 5 or to 10 years, but in terms of the actual soft skills, being able to solve complex enterprise level problems and, bringing innovative ideas back to the market, I think that sort of skill set is not going anywhere and will always be relevant. So do I think service design will still be relevant? I definitely think it will stay around for the next 5 to 10 years. Thank you so much for watching, guys. And if you haven't seen it already, make sure you click over here to see what a UX or UI designer actually does. If you guys have any specific roles that you want me to cover, make sure you drop it down in the comments below and I'll do my best to cover it. Also, if you haven't already, please make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click on that notification button so you won't miss out on another episode. Bye.